This hearing of the Subcommittee on Conservation and Forestry, entitled Title II Conservation Programs, Exploring Climate-Smart Practices, will come to order. Welcome and thank you for joining today's hearing. After brief opening remarks, members will receive testimony from our witnesses today, and then the hearing will be open for questions. Members will be recognized in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority members, and in the order of arrival for those members who have joined us after the hearing was called to order. When you are recognized, you will be asked to unmute your microphone, and you will have 5 minutes to ask your questions or make a comment. If you are not speaking, I ask that you remain muted in order to minimize background noise. In order to get in as many questions as possible, the timer will stay consistently visible on your screen. In consultation with the ranking member and pursuant to Rule 11E, I want to make members of the subcommittee aware that other members of the full committee may join us today. I am excited to be here today for our first hearing of the Subcommittee on Conservation and Forestry in the 117th Congress, and for the opportunity to work alongside my colleague, Ranking Member Doug LaMalfa, and the rest of the esteemed members of this subcommittee. In addition to increasing farm productivity and profitability, conservation agriculture holds enormous potential in our efforts to combat the climate crisis, both through increased soil carbon sequestration and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. As we look to scale the adoption of conservation practices, there is perhaps no greater tool available than the Farm Bill's conservation programs. Title II programs provide much-needed technical and financial assistance to encourage the adoption of cover crops, reduced and no-till management systems, and prescribed grazing systems, among many other climate-smart practices. As we have seen firsthand, these programs are working well in Central Virginia. Studies show that these programs are effective. Not only do they facilitate greater adoption of conservation practices, but they also make it more likely that farmers will keep implementing these practices in the long term, to the benefit of our climate, clean water, and the health of our rural communities. What's more is these investments are paying dividends to farmers' bottom line. When farmers participate in these voluntary conservation programs, they do not only reduce carbon dioxide emissions in the environment by sequestering carbon through healthier soils, but they also improve crop quantity, yield, and profit margins. Put simply, any investment Congress makes in Title II programs are an investment in the long-term economic success of rural America and America's farmers. In recent years, USDA has developed new tools that make it easier than ever to consider climate mitigation benefits during the conservation planning process. And thanks to USDA's publication of the Blue Book, we have technical guidelines and science-based methods to quantify emission sinks in agriculture. And likewise, the development of the Comet Farm online tool has made it possible to assess a farm's carbon footprint and see how alternative voluntary management projects and practices could achieve greenhouse gas reductions. These tools are exciting ways to maximize climate benefits while also making things easier for farmers. And as these tools are refined, I'm hopeful that they will strengthen conservation programs and maximize the benefits delivered to farmers. In this spirit, I worked across the aisle to introduce the Growing Climate Solutions Act on Earth Day this year. This legislation would create a certification program at the U.S. Department of Agriculture to help solve technical entry barriers that prevent farm and forest landowner participation in carbon credit markets. This bill is almost universally endorsed by national farmer organizations like the American Farm Bureau Federation, the National Farmers Union, while also gaining support from large environmental groups like the Environmental Defense Fund and the National Wildlife Federation, and corporations like McDonald's, Bayer, and Microsoft. This legislation has built a broad coalition because it empowers farmers to continue climate-friendly conservation practices. It helps farmers unlock unlock new revenue streams through private carbon markets, and it empowers the USDA to further develop tools that empower climate-friendly conservation practices. I'm excited to hear from our witnesses today on their experiences utilizing these practices and the role that the Farm Bill's programs play in facilitating their adoption. And while we've made great progress in developing the science and the tools that let us better quantify the climate benefits of conservation, I also hope to hear today if there are areas where further research or support may be needed. With that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Congressman Doug LaMalfa, for any opening remarks.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Chair Spanberger, for convening the hearing today and for our panelists that will be speaking with us. The 2018 Farm Bill offered important environmental and resource benefits through USDA's suite of voluntary incentive-based conservation programs. The conservation title provides an estimated $6 billion per year to farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners for the implementation of practices that truly do work. Through these voluntary programs, producers can improve soil health and water quality, better manage their lands, and incorporate innovations like increased energy-efficient farming practices. Our conservation delivery system is a proven model that leverages significant funding as a win-win for both producers and the environmental needs. Because of its effectiveness, NRCS conservation programs have been in the spotlight in recent years and become a staple in ongoing climate discussions. While these programs generate countless on-farm benefits, they also directly result in carbon sequestration. As we continue to dwell on climate-related policy, voluntary conservation does have an important role to continue to play. I think it's very important to recognize the great conservation work farmers and ranchers and foresters are already doing each and every day, and they don't always get credit for what's been done in the past before this became such a hot topic. Despite the calls from some climate alarmists, the U.S. is already making great progress towards meeting carbon reduction goals. The U.S. generates less than 15% of the world's anthropogenic carbon emissions. That number is continuing to decline in the coming decades. Currently, U.S. farm productivity and management practices have increased dramatically over the past 70 years. So, U.S. farm productivity increasing by 287% since 1948, the inputs have remained relatively the same. That means the efficiency is going up, more bang for the buck, more bang for the same amount of carbon. In short, we're producing more food and fiber while using the same amount of resources we did generations ago. Additionally, we need to recognize the considerable resources already provided by the Farm Bill to support voluntary conservation and not rush to unproven approaches that may not actually address the concern being made of climate or consider if it will benefit farmers and ranchers directly. In addition to improving soil health, there are a variety of other existing agricultural practices and technologies that are just as beneficial must be fully utilized. This includes increasing the deployment of precision agriculture to help produce over-fertilization and runoff, and adoption of technologies such as anaerobic digesters that convert livestock-generated methane to renewable natural gas. Incorporating new technologies and innovative practices will reduce emissions, improve water and air quality, and provide new revenue for farmers and ranchers in the process. No singular solution will be appropriate to each crop, each cropping system, or region. Opportunities in ag extend beyond soil health and cover crops. What works for corn in Iowa will not necessarily work for wheat out in the West, or rice in the Mississippi Delta, or rice in Northern California. We need to resist turning the Farm Bill conservation title into the climate title. We cannot allow one natural resource concern to completely overshadow all others. These programs must continue to be voluntary, which means we must offer practices that provide farmers choices. Although forests are not the focus of today's hearing necessarily, they must be part of the conversation. Our forests are natural carbon sinks and hold great potential for reducing emitted carbon and sequestering it. For example, any finished wood product stores carbon indefinitely. By improving forest health and actively managing our forests, we can encourage healthier lands, prevent potential fires, and the millions of acres of destruction we see so much of these days, as well as the release of more carbon dioxide than all of California's power. So during a recent House Appropriations Committee hearing, U.S. Forest Service Chief Vicki Christensen mentioned our forests are sequestering 14% of all U.S. carbon emissions. That number could be nearly doubled to 20 to 28% through more reforestation and restoration, greater forest resiliency, and the use of more forest products which store carbon. But we must not be hamstrung from actually getting out there and doing the work. With that in mind, as we talk about climate and reducing carbon dioxide, I believe we must take a hard look at how we manage our forests and how we address the wildfire crisis and the huge costs via budget or to our landscape. 2020 was the most devastating fire we have on record. That includes especially significant fires in my home state of California. We must do more to prevent small fires from unnecessarily becoming huge mega fires that release enormous amounts of otherwise stored carbon dioxide. Addressing wildfires is a crisis and an emergency we no longer can ignore or continue to kick the can down the road. Thanks again to all of our witnesses for taking the time to come be part of this today, to provide your testimony, and we can have this good conversation. As we consider the many stewardship proposals and ideas before Congress, as this committee starts thinking about the next Farm Bill, your input will be invaluable from here on out, and it's much appreciated. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member LaMalfa. Your comments made me think of something that a constituent producer said, which is farmers are the original conservationists. The chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so witnesses may begin their testimony and to ensure that there is ample time for our questions. I'm pleased to welcome such a distinguished panel of witnesses to our hearing today. Our witnesses bring to our hearing a wide range of experience and expertise, and I thank you all for joining us. Our first witness today is Mr. Charles Isbell, Jr. Mr. Isbell raises livestock on his family's 340-acre farm, Keenbell Farm, in Rockville, Virginia, not too far from the district I represent. The farm specializes in grass-fed beef, pork, poultry, turkey, eggs, and specialty grains, using intense rotational management, precision agriculture, and conservation practices like cover cropping. He was named the 2020 Virginia Farmer of the Year. He's a founding member of the Common Grain Alliance and a member of the Virginia Association of Biological Farming, as well as the Virginia Farm Bureau Young Farmers Program. Our next witness today is Ms. Kimberly Ratcliffe. Ms. Ratcliffe manages Caney Creek Ranch, a diversified ranch in east central Texas that was started by her parents. She has worked on the ranch since 2007 and also owns Farm to Freezer Beef, a family-run business that offers fresh beef direct from East Texas ranches. In 2008, Kimberly helped found 100 Ranchers, which is an organization comprised of minority farmers and ranchers in Texas to promote agriculture at the local level. And last year, Ms. Ratcliffe was appointed to serve on the USDA Advisory Committee on Minority Farmers. Our third witness today is Dr. Keith Paustian. Dr. Paustian serves as the University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences and Senior Research Scientist at the National Resource Ecology Laboratory at Colorado State University. A major focus of his work involves modeling, field measurement, and development of assessment tools for soil carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions from soils. Dr. Paustian assisted with the development of the Comet Farm tool used by USDA and the development of models and methodology used to estimate the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions reported annually by the EPA. Our fourth and final witness today is Mr. James Johansen. Mr. Johansen has been serving as president of the California Farm Bureau since 2017. He serves on the American Farm Bureau Federation Board of Directors, and previously he served as the chairman of the California Young Farmers and Ranchers State Committee. Mr. Johansen is a farmer himself, growing olives and citrus fruit in Oroville, California. Welcome to all of our witnesses today, and we will now proceed with hearing your testimony. You will each have 5 minutes, and there should be a timer visible on your screen that will count down to 0, at which point your time has expired. Mr. Isbell, please begin with your opening statement whenever you are ready. Thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify here today. I'm a third-generation farmer, co-owner of Keenbell Farm located in Hanover County and resident of Virginia's 1st District. On our farm, we utilize regenerative agriculture practices while we work to produce and market directly to the consumer quality grass-fed beef, pasture-raised pork, chicken, turkeys, eggs, and specialty non-GMO grains. Our mission is to improve the quality of life of our customers, community, environment, and ourselves by producing the highest quality foods, products, using humane, sustainable, biological, sound practices. Our focus since inception has been to promote a living, healthy soil, utilizing forages, livestock, and crops as the management tools to accomplish this goal. While growing and developing our farming operation, we've been able to develop relationships with our local natural resources conservation service offices, soil and water conservation districts, Virginia Cooperative Extension agents, and USDA service centers. While working towards our overall mission statement and sharing our vision of healing the land utilizing innovative approaches to livestock and crop production, our approach relies heavily on the use of cover crops, particularly multi-species cover crops, no tillage, and additionally incorporating livestock into this cover cash crop rotation. Our local agency's recognition of our approach to environmental stewardship made us aware of Title II conservation programs that would fit our production model. And we're dedicated to utilizing the conservation programs, regardless of whether we receive an award, if the practices are economically feasible. And if awarded, the offsetting capital is put towards other conservation programs, which are not covered by these outlined conservation programs. We've been fortunate to participate in numerous environmental quality incentive programs, EQIP, and in which we've implemented stream exclusion fencing, prescribed grazing systems, cover crop, nutrient management planning, livestock water systems, just to name a few. Environmental stewardship is a foundational value of our farm and one key factor when we evaluate management decisions in our operation. Being that our farm's in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we made the decision to install exclusion fencing to keep livestock out of lakes and streams on the farm. The fencing was installed with twice the minimum buffer to provide additional filter support and stimulate wildlife refuge areas. As part of our conservation efforts, we practice intense rotational management of all of our livestock species we raise. Most are moved daily, but at a minimum every 3 days. This rotation allows for natural distribution of manure, preventing the buildup and potential runoff of nutrients. And this rotational management system, combined with the exclusion from our lake and streams, required the installation of over 12,000 feet of underground water lines and 40,000 feet of fence lines. We utilize precision agriculture with grid sample and variable rate fertility application. And in addition, we utilize multi-species cover crops, both to sustain a living cover in the traditional sense, but also as a key component of our crop production cycle that's virtually eliminated the need for chemical applications. Our structured management of livestock and cover crops have allowed for almost doubling of the soil organic matter, which reduces erosion, increases nutrient holding capacities, and reducing runoff. Conversion of cropland formerly under conventionally management system was a hurdle to work through as we grew. Time and management has allowed for the simulation of soil biology and building of soil organic matter and health. This continues to be our focus in current managed land as we take on new land and expanding our operation. While implementing this approach to livestock and crop production with the assistance of Title II conservation programs, we've seen substantial benefits from the implementation of these practices. We've eliminated erosion, doubled our soil's organic matter, improved our forage and crop quality. We've confirmed these improvements with both anecdotal observation and empirical scientific data. Although the benefits from Title II conservation programs are great in number, the implementation of these programs could be improved. As with most programs relying on budgetary allocations, there are many more dollars applied to than funding provides. Focus needs to be directed to allow for a greater access to these programs and assistance provided to ensure continuation of these conservation practices when funding is not available. As producers, we see the financial and physical benefits of conservation, but they will be more prone to continuing previously awarded practices with this focus. Barriers to greater adoption of these programs and practices include limited staffing at NRCS service centers, limited access to the offices themselves, excessive paperwork for application, capital cost requirement upfront of the producer, and program requirements sometimes can be too restrictive in today's environmental conditions, which sometimes eliminate their eligibility due to inability to comply with outlined timeframes. and it doesn't allow for some of the newer dynamic regenerative agriculture practices to be implemented with the same. But with these problems, I also provide recommendations that would assist in improving the implementation and adoption of these conservation programs and practices. Support continued increased funding allocation for Title II programs with a directed focus of continued outreach, post-producer funding to encourage the continuation of conservation practices. For example, after program awarded, providing the technical assistance to assist the producer in understanding both the environmental and financial benefits from the awarded program. This additional support will give confidence to producers to continue conservation efforts beyond the program award once the operational benefits can be identified. Conversion of the NRCS brick and mortar paper application process to a more computer-based system with remote accessibility. Understandable that some efforts have been placed with the pandemic to do so, but still as a producer, I have to go in person to file for crop reporting, most recent, the CFAP applications and the like. If a farmer had a web portal with all the farms associated to them, they could apply, file for cover crop reporting, publish yield data without the need for the infrastructure to house the current paper system. We should provide NRCS agents with the tools, technology, and flexibility to spend more time out in the field with producers. This will allow them to make more contact and hopefully convey the benefits of these conservation programs for continued use. Some of the program restrictions, they require producers to provide all upfront payment to implement these programs with the hope of reimbursement at a later date, as long as complying with the defined requirements of the program. If we allowed for upfront funding at the time of award, we may see more adoption of these conservation programs. Lastly, I would recommend for allowing more flexibility within the program guidelines to better reflect the changes in climate, environmental events, and modern regenerative agriculture practices to be more compliant and more allow for greater adoption of these practices. By working together through the implementation of conservation and regenerative agriculture practices, we can heal the soil that feeds the plants, which in turn feeds all of us. I want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for your opening statement, Mr. Isbell. Ms. Ratcliffe, please begin whenever you are ready.
Chairwoman Spanberger, Ranking Member LaMaffla, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of Caney Creek Ranch. After leaving a New York City financial information firm in 2007, I returned to Caney Creek Ranch, my family operation in Oakwood, a small town in central East Texas. Our family-owned ranch was established in 2002 by my parents, Wesley and Marie Ratcliffe. I managed a daily operation where we produce Charbet cattle, which bulls, replacement heifers, semen, embryos are sold across the world. Working with my father and brother, I am leading our family business into the future, developing new line of businesses, using best practices on the ranch to increase resilience and efficiency, and strongly contributing to the success of our entire community. I am one of the founders of the 100 Ranchers, a community-based organization supporting minority producers across the country. It has introduced me to a number of producers who have shared their personal stories about their journey into agriculture and many important conservation lessons I have learned. A friend of mine, a third-generation rancher from North Carolina, shared with me the importance of keeping forests as forests and passing on the responsibility to future generations. A friend of mine, a third-generation family, started in 1916, where his grandfather purchased 38 acres for $864. As he described, this was a great feat for a man, but particularly for an African American. Initially, the focus was to clear the land, but as the old saying goes, money does not grow on trees. But today, the story is different. Organizations like Sustainable Forestry for African American Land Retention Projects, where I serve on the Prairie View A&M local chapter board, are working with small landowners to introduce them to sustainable forestry as a tool to increase family income and land value. This includes silver pasture, a management system that integrates trees with forage and livestock production. Silver pasture system optimizes three components: forage, livestock, and ecosystem. Trees are planted into rows or clusters, or forests are thinned to provide significant light for forage. On our family operation, we incorporate existing forage area to provide shade, timber, food for our livestock. The carbon captured in the soil and the trees more than makes up for the greenhouse gases that ruminants emit through belch and gas. The silver pasture system increases our productions of meat and milk, in part because the shade of the trees reduces stress on the livestock. The trees also provide a haven for wildlife habitat. The additional trees has brought about an increase in number of quail, deer, turkey that inhabit our farm. The trees also act as a buffer, preventing harmful nutrients from entering a nearby water source. We also practice rotational grazing, allowing our pastures to rest and recover and soil health to improve. We were introduced to many conservation plans, including rotational grazing, when we started working with USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. We learned how to improve efficiency of our pasture, about cross-fishing, as well as about programs after working with NRCS to develop a conservation plan. Conservation plan is free. It is often the introduction to NRCS cost-sharing programs like EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentive Program, like Conservation Stewardship Program, Conservation Reserve Program. These programs support voluntary conservation efforts with landowners in the United States, helping direct owners to practice benefits of environment. Unfortunately, participation rate of conservation plans and cost-sharing programs are low among small landowners. Minority landowners are even lower rates of participation, have fewer acres enrolled, are less likely to afford cost share requirements, and less satisfied with the program. To close this gap, there needs to be a new approach to encourage program participation by small landowners in general, but especially minority landowners. Peer-to-peer education about proper management is essential to achieve conservation goals. This is why it's important to support organizations like the Texas Agricultural Land Trust, the National Grazing Land Coalition, and the Sustainable Forestry for African American Retention Project to provide resources and technical support to producers on the ground. While there are a number of wonderful programs in NRCS, it's important for us to remember our work is not complete. For the past 60 years, agriculture industries admittedly focus on treating climate system with practices and inputs rather than addressing the problem with science-based holistic principle. Innovative producers today understand that we do not solve ecological problems by implementing old practices. Rather, we implement best practices that we know work based on science and explore new ways of working. It begins with maintaining a solid foundation with a healthy soil that helps money grow on trees. We need investment in capital to engage in best practices. We need education. We need access to market. We need partnership to ensure that we all benefit from opportunities for my industry. Specifically, minority producers address climate change to ensure food security and diversity of our networks of producers. I appreciate you allowing me to submit this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Ratcliffe, for your testimony today. And Dr. Paustian, please begin whenever you are ready.
Chairwoman Spanberger, Ranking Member, the MOFA, and committee members, my name is Dr. Keith Paustian. I'm a professor at Colorado State University. I do research and teaching on soils, agriculture, and climate. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak at your hearing today. Agriculture, both in the U.S. and globally, is facing several challenges while being called upon to deliver more and more products and services to an increasing global population. Agriculture is a significant source of greenhouse gases, accounting for about 10% of total U.S. emissions and 14% of global emissions. However, agricultural soils can also be a carbon sink, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and converting it into soil organic matter that improves soil fertility and soil health. The key determinants for sequestering carbon and improving soil health are the agronomic practices employed by the farmer. Past management practices have, over time, significantly depleted soil carbon stocks on our agricultural lands. However, we can reverse much of these historic losses by adopting a variety of conservation practices, including reduced and no tillage, cover crops, more diverse crop rotations, and other practices. In addition to sequestering carbon, many of these practices help to tighten up nutrient cycles, reducing nutrient losses that contaminate ground and surface waters. Also, soils rich in organic matter are more resilient to flooding and drought conditions. So while these agricultural practices, these conservation practices, seeing increased use, there's massive room for additional adoption. For example, cover crops are currently planted on about less than 5% of our annual cropland. USDA programs such as EQIP, Conservation Stewardship Program, and others have been key to encouraging producers to adopt conservation practices across the country. Although many of these practices can pay for themselves in the long run by improving soil function and crop yields, there are numerous barriers to adoption. Farming is inherently risky and farmers tend to be risk averse. Thus, the support payments and technical assistance from USDA help to mitigate risk while farmers transition to these new practices. My research team at Colorado State University has been involved with USDA over the past 12 years in developing the Comet Farm system. Comet Farm is an online tool that is used to evaluate different conservation practices that can increase carbon sequestration and reduce greenhouse gas emissions on an individual farm or ranch. Tool is available, it's free, it's on the internet. The tool implements USDA's entity scale greenhouse gas inventory methods, which were developed by top experts from government, academia, and industry. Comet Farm currently has thousands of users, including federal agencies, state governments, NGOs, companies, as well as individual farmers and ranchers. To bring about transformative changes on our nation's agricultural lands will also require increased participation from the private sector. Over the past couple of years, there's been growing interest from major companies towards investing in carbon drawdown approaches to help meet corporate sustainability goals. To increase the willingness of the private sector to invest in soil carbon solutions and also to design optimal public policy, we need to improve our abilities to cost-effectively measure and monitor carbon sequestration. While we have many excellent field experiments as well as highly capable tools such as Comet Farm, there are a number of R&D initiatives that could significantly improve our capabilities. A number of these priorities have been documented in a 2019 study by the National Academy of Sciences. One is the need for a national system of on-farm measurements of soil carbon stock changes. The National Resources Inventory System, currently managed by USDA, would be an ideal platform to supplement with some on-the-ground soil measurements. Our forest inventory system provides this type of information on biomass carbon stocks. We need something similar for our soils. We also need additional capabilities for performance testing of new technologies, such as new crop varieties, new soil amendments, new regenerative conservation practices. Finally, there's a growing scientific consensus that improved quantification systems can be achieved by more fully integrating ground-based measurements and monitoring networks, remote sensing, and dynamic models. In summary, USDA Title II programs have been instrumental in promoting the adoption of conservation practices that yield significant climate benefits, as well as healthier soils and ecosystems. Good tools exist to expand and advance policies to promote climate-smart agriculture. Further improvements in quantification technologies can help increase engagement by the private sector to take these improved practices to scale. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Paustian. Mr. Johansen, please begin with your 5 minutes when you are ready.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairwoman Spanberger, Ranking Member Lamalfa, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm Jamie Johansen, President of the California Farm Bureau, and a first-generation olive and citrus farmer. California's producers are all too familiar with changing weather conditions. The current U.S. Drought Monitor reports that over 97% of California is experiencing moderate to exceptional drought, impacting over 34 million Californians. We're also focused to have above normal fire potential this year. California's wildfires are very personal to me, not only as president of an organization who has witnessed countless stories of farmers' loss and frustration, but also because my family has been evacuated three times in the last 4 years due to wildfire. Sadly, there is no wildfire season in California. The risk is now year-round. and it is immense. Last year, the U.S. Forest Service stated in testimony that they would need $2 to $3 billion per year for treatments required to get ahead of hazardous fuel levels on the National Forest System. We urge the committee to include both forestry and grazing practices as strategies to restore forest health and rangeland health and increase fire resilience. We also ask that the subcommittee helps to ensure that sufficient disaster assistance programs, such as the Wildfire Hurricane Indemnity Program Plus, are made available to producers. Our producers are at the forefront of investment in agricultural research and adopting practices that improve productivity while enhancing sustainability. Conservation is widespread in California agriculture. Our farmers and ranchers have a proven track record of doing more with less. Practices include water recharge, irrigation efficiency, energy conservation, and investment in farm equipment with cleaner emissions. With so much already happening at the field level, it is important to consider how new federal policies and programs will overlay with existing state climate programs, and most importantly, grower-led initiatives. Title II programs provide producers with additional ability to adopt conservation practices while improving agricultural production. We are appreciative of the improvements made to the conservation title by this committee in the last Farm Bill, including enhanced flexibility of programs to meet producer needs. EQIP is the most utilized program in California, assisting producers with options in achieving greater conservation goals. It's important that any changes made to Title II do not walk back those flexibilities. To help ensure climate benefits are adopted, NRCS could consider prioritizing EQIP contracts that result in emission reductions, increased carbon sequestration, and improved climate resilience. Prioritization would still need to remain flexible for all crop types with sufficient levels of financial and technical assistance. California produces over 400 commodities with various cropping systems and farm sizes. Practices will need to be broad and outcome-based, emphasizing a list of options as opposed to a prescriptive checklist. The nexus between the lack of broadband in many agricultural areas and implementation should also be considered. We also urge the committee to consider adding feed, genetics, and nutrition management as eligible practices within the Conservation Innovation Grant Program to provide additional opportunities for farmers to test the newest technologies and evaluate their impact within their operation. While trials around feed additives and genetics are not explicitly excluded, it is also not clear that they are included. We're also very supportive of the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which offers producers the opportunity to work collaboratively with NRCS and other conservation partners. We supported the change in the 2018 Farm Bill that reconfigured RCPP as a standalone program. And we are currently an RCPP partner working collaboratively on tricolored blackbird nesting colonies with many of our dairy farms in the Central Valley. Regardless of programs or practice, financial and technical assistance must be consistent, sustainable and long-term if our expectations of producers are also long-term. We must also consider the indirect pressure this may place on important CCC-funded programs.
Sir, you might.
Market Development Program, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, as well as livestock and other disaster programs. California Farm Bureau supports producer participation in voluntary climate smart practices that sequester carbon, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and build climate resilience. While many have been incorporating climate smart practices on their operations for years, to further adoption on the on-farm climate smart practices, we must not only compensate early adopters, but also consider the economics of the farm and assist those being expected to do more. Only in working together can we achieve solutions that make agriculture more climate resilient while remaining viable. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johansen. At this time, members will be recognized for questions in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority members. You will be recognized for 5 minutes each in order to allow us to get as many questions as possible. Please keep your microphones muted until you are recognized in order to minimize background noise. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. But before I begin, I would like to offer a USDA report on cover crop trends, programs, and practices in the United States for the record. Mr. Isbell, in addition to reduced soil erosion, improved water filtration, and greater weed and pest suppression, cover crops provide important environmental benefits, including carbon storage. And according to the latest report, cover crop adoption increased by approximately 50% from 10.3 million acres in 2012 to 15.4 million acres in 2017. While kind of rather modest in terms of national cropland acreage, the report does demonstrate that programs like CSP and EQIP are helping to drive practice adoption. In your opening statements, you did talk to some degree about the ways that implementation could be improved. You talked about some of the programs being too restrictive, the value of technical assistance, particularly post-implementation. But I was wondering if you could speak to the importance of these programs, EQIP and CSP, in achieving greater carbon sequestration through practices like the use of cover crops. Because as we here in Congress are debating policies that are investing in expanding economic opportunities and combating the climate crisis, I want to have a firm understanding of the practical impact on growers and producers. If we are thinking about potentially making additional investments in these voluntary and incentive-based programs, while also increasing funding for technical assistance, I'm curious what your thoughts would be in terms of what that would mean for you on the ground.
Thank you. Absolutely. So forages and grasslands have the greatest ability to sequester carbon in that the carbon is then stored in the soil. And so the greatest flexibility to increase carbon sequestration is by cycling those forages and grasses via grazing, haying, mowing. And that's what we've been able to do with our cover crops utilization. And by doing so, not only are we sequestering more carbon, but we're also able to cycle and retain nutrients, free up nutrients that are previously insoluble in the soil, and then also, more importantly, build organic matter, which increases our water holding capacity, thus drought proofing. And so with utilization of these programs and these conservation practices, we've been able to increase our financial bottom line. Mm-hmm. And in that, we're able to produce more forages, more crops, despite potential drought or lack of rainfall because of the building of that organic matter, in addition to capturing the nutrients, which then reduces the need for additional fertility application. And I think that it's important to continue these fundings and then also to ensure that the technical assistance is there to follow through with the farmers to actually be able to show them the long-lasting financial and environmental benefits from these programs.
Thank you very much. Dr. Paustian, in your testimony, you noted that while payments from our Working Lands program like EQIP and CSP can help cover some of the initial costs of embracing some of these conservation programs, they don't often cover the full costs of the practices experienced by farmers up front. You also noted that while on-farm benefits like improved soil function and yield stability can help pay for these benefits, there are still significant barriers in adoption of these practices. So given that, I'm curious, what value do you see in helping farmers gain access potentially to private carbon markets that provide additional revenue streams for growers who may choose to adopt these practices?
Thank you, Chairman Spanberger. I certainly think there's opportunities, and they're growing for farmers to monetize, if you will, some of the ecosystem benefits that they're creating with these practices. I mentioned in my opening remarks that a number of industries are interested in carbon drawdown, and so carbon offers a way to do that. So I think as long as farmers can participate and get a fair return and are able to implement the practices that work well on their operations, then I think it's certainly an opportunity that I think would be good to see if it could increase. I'll mention another thing, and that is that the farmers also have potential to get a premium on their products if consumers are looking to pay more for low carbon products that are produced in the agricultural space. And I think we see increasing interest in that. And so that's another way in which I think farmers can increase their bottom line to help over this transition period in particular.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paustian. Certainly, as consumers learn the benefit of, let's say, grass-fed beef, understanding actually the environmental impact as well of making food choices along those lines, I think is important and particularly helpful for the producer. Continuing on, I now will recognize Ranking Member LaMalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. To my neighbor, Mr. Johansen there, California Farm Bureau, thank you for your testimony today and for your good work. Let me jump right into it here. Now, the conservation programs and the conservation title we've had in the farm bills, they're currently oversubscribed. So there's more farmers applying for them than are really able to utilize it. So how do you think, if we're moving into new programs, is this going to take away from the current ones we have in place with EQIP and et cetera? Ought not we prioritize the existing ones that are indeed very well liked and voluntary? I think a key point. So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the important part of any conservation program, coming out of the USDA is also how does it work with state programs as well to further those federal dollars. We can do that at the state level. We have a healthy soils program here in California that has been successful, administered by the California Department of Food and Agriculture, but also works well with NRCS conservation practice standards. It also is a program, ironically, that uses the Comet Planner, which we're discussing here today as well, to implement. I think also too is that we also have programs here in California in terms of equipment replacement for more efficient tractors, irrigation pumps as well. I think it's a good thing that we're overprescribed, but I think we have to figure out how we engage the private market as well, since there are consumer benefits to this who can also participate, because it's always going to be a level. And that's one of the things we can have these programs for farmers. And one of the problems we have here in California is the inconsistency of funding. So you start a program and then the next year maybe the funding isn't there to do it, so the program's going to hold. Yeah. So I think it's vitally important that as these programs are overprescribed, and unless we can get more funding for it, that we leverage and prioritize with those states and those farmers who bring in additional dollars.
Well, that'll look like we'll have to either boost funding on the current programs and discover new funding for a new direction, or we're going to see these current programs perhaps be reduced in order to go in a new direction. That's my concern on that. Mr. Johansen, also please, we had some very compelling testimony by our neighbor, great guy, Dave Daly, in the Resources Subcommittee last week on the fire situation, up there in East Butte County, but one that's kind of a microcosm of much fire all around the country. What do you see we should be doing to further prioritize on our forest management? As you mentioned, your own area being evacuated, and then the litigation that seems to bog down, as I kind of alluded to in my opening statement, that bogs down any management or salvage operations need to be done for making forests healthy and good carbon grabbers, so to speak.
Yeah. Dr. Daly, a tragic story. I would encourage everyone to look him up and his story, the generations that he spent up there in the Plumas National Forest. Now will be probably multiple generations before it's returned to normal. But we're seeing that in California, as we saw 4 million acres burned in California. Believe it or not, that is well, it's a record in the modern time. In the early 1900s, it wasn't unusual for 8 to 9 million acres to burn at a time in California. As we say, California is either underwater or it's on fire. And how do we appropriately deal with these natural disasters? And it's about management. And we have great resources in California. Whether it is our soils that produce 400 different commodities or our forests that at one time really fueled rural California, particularly in the Redwood Coast, where I grew up in Humboldt County, working summers at the Pacific Lumber Company, but it's changed. And with any amount of resources that we have, and if we define what a resource is, that which is to be used for economic gain or in time of need, that is what we have in California, a lot of resources. However, we haven't properly managed it. So the opposite of what happens with a resource, we've proven has become a liability. And the same also goes with the recent drought declaration so soon after the last emergency drought declaration that we had in California. How do we manage our water as well? As we know, the temperatures are changing. Lake Oroville, Headwaters State Water Project, is 4 miles as a crow flies from my farm, is dependent on snow. And Lake Shasta, which is the Central Valley project, the federal project, it is dependent on rain for the most part. But we know that the snowpack, which this year we saw 500,000 extra acres disappear because the snow didn't make its way down the mountain. So we have to adapt to either expand our dams in those high runoff periods, or also another important part that we're discovering is groundwater recharge. So, we have to manage our resources better, and also how to return funding and profitability to our forests, because simply if the national forests aren't being properly managed, as we've seen in the private forests, it gets overwhelmed with fuel and great destruction happening on private property as well.
Yeah, great point on that at the end there. With people around here don't understand why we have the funds like secure rural schools that make up for the forestry that used to cause timber receipts to help keep local schools and local county roads up. That was the impetus for that. So without the forest industry, and instead we get millions of acres of fire with this lack of management. So I appreciate that testimony, and I will yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentlewoman from New Hampshire for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate this committee. It's great to be back on the Ag Committee and Conservation Forest Subcommittee this Congress. I do want to begin by noting the dedication and commitment of farmers and foresters in New Hampshire to reducing emissions and mitigating climate change on our land. Many have already undertaken practices like tillage management, crop rotation, and the use of cover crops. Sometimes it's on their own initiative, but often it's through participation in the Title II programs. In the Granite State, we're lucky to have an incredible team at the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. The staff understand our unique agricultural needs of our region and are terrific partners and technical advisors for both farmers and foresters. They expertly manage New Hampshire's participation in NRCS programs, including enrolling over 55,000 acres last year alone. While programs like EQIP and CSP are much relied upon staples in the Granite State, NRCS fosters many other climate-smart practices that support our region. Just last month, the Merrimack River Watershed Council received nearly $7 million in RCPP funding to conserve land, enhance climate resilience, and restore wildlife habitats in our watershed. This type of public-private partnership is truly a win-win. Critical farm and forest lands are saved, while the water supply for cities like Nashua are also protected. Additionally, NRCS has supported unique projects like the construction of a high tunnel at the New Hampshire Technical Institute in Concord that was completed just last week. The tunnel will allow beginning farmers to field test farming and conservation techniques right on campus. And I'm always excited to hear about these types of projects and look ahead to the next Farm Bill. I'm eager to explore how Congress can help strengthen NRCS' role in combating climate change in the years to come. On that note, Dr. Paustian, I was very interested in your research concerning carbon capture in agricultural soils. And I'm curious how you see working forests fitting into the broader picture. Based on your research or your colleagues, would you have recommendations about how NRCS programs can best support carbon capture in our working forests?
Thank you, Representative Custer. I think there's several opportunities that are both in working forests as well as in forests in agricultural lands, if you will, things like agroforestry. And I think Ms. Ratcliffe mentioned silvopasteurism on her operation. And I think these kinds of systems, as has been pointed out, can both sequester carbon in the soil, but also in the biomass, in woody biomass that persists for a long time, as well as providing shade and other ecosystem benefits of those kind of things. NRCS does have a pretty active involvement in, I know, agroforestry systems, as they do also in working forests. I would say in general, in most, if you think of private forest land as forest land, so they're just producing wood or wildlife habitat, these sorts of things, probably the key quantity for carbon sequestration is still in the biomass carbon. And I think most of the work involved in how do we manage the vegetation to optimize forest health as well as carbon sequestration really focuses primarily on the biomass. But certainly I think there are, in instances like afforestation or reforestation, and to the extent that NRCS provides advice on that, then there are carbon benefits that also accrue with reestablishing forests on, for example, degraded lands or other things like that.
Great, thank you. Just quickly, Mr. Isbell, I'm glad to hear of your work that you're doing and appreciate your collaboration with groups like 4-H. Briefly, could you tell us more about encouraging farmers, including young and beginning farmers, to adopt good conservation practices? And I apologize, my time is almost up.
Thank you, Representative Custer. We do a lot of outreach, and I think that within the farming community, farmers are rather slow to adopt new practices. And so that's why the importance of having field days, outreach to neighboring farmers is the greatest opportunity to actually show financial and physical benefits from these conservation practices, in which then we've seen our neighboring farms and farmers who have attended our events to start to implement some of these conservation practices because of being able to see and talk to somebody who has been doing it and realizing those benefits.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. To all of our witnesses, I'd like to say thank you for offering your time and expertise, particularly those of you that are our farmers and ranchers, because I know this is a busy time of year. Climate change is clearly the topic of this Congress, as we've already had innumerable briefings, member meetings, hearings, and proposed legislation over the past year or so to address it. However, when I'm in the district, this is not an issue that I hear frequently about. As a matter of fact, it wouldn't even make the top 10. What my constituents are more concerned about, particularly in agriculture, is labor. I've spent the last several weeks in the district meeting and communicating with constituents, and I'll tell you, they got a lot of concerns. In fact, right now, I understand in Atlanta, Georgia, there is no gas. Already lines, there's pipelines down. We got a war on fossil fuels, and it is, chaos everywhere at the border, in major cities. A lot of things that we need to be addressing, but certainly none more important than agriculture, because if certain people get control of this country, I believe climate change is going to exceed starvation. And that's what we're talking about here, is the food needs of the country. In fact, there are many leaders, business one business leader in particular said that we need to go to synthetic beef. And so I don't know where all this is coming from, but obviously it affects many of our witnesses here right now. The other thing is skyrocketing lumber prices. This is the Committee on Forestry. It's adding $35,000 to the cost of an average home in my district. Obviously, gasoline's up. Food prices are skyrocketing. Folks, we need to get to work on these issues that are affecting the American people. And we got to do it quick. The best conservationists in the world are our farmers, and what we've done from a technological standpoint is amazing. And certainly we want this Congress to help with these conservation issues, but at the same time, it does not need to be top down, one size fits all by a bunch of intellectuals in Washington, D.C. It needs to be bottom up, as the testimony from Ms. Ratcliffe on the practices she's put into place, which I thought I was very impressed with, to be successful and to sell some of the finest beef I would propose in this country. As far as the academic study called the World Market Conditions Success suggests set-aside is not an effective foreign policy for corn and soybeans, argues that set-aside programs are not an effective foreign policy because it sends a market signal to our competitors to plant more. Dr. Paustian, how concerned are you that by idling tens of millions of acres in the U.S., we could very likely be exacerbating greenhouse gas emissions as our competitors respond to take the U.S. market share here?
Well, thank you, Representative Allen, for that question. I'm not an ag economist, but I've studied the question some. My understanding is that the things like the Conservation Reserve Program, as currently configured, is not leading to markedly increased commodity prices that would be a driver then of say agricultural expansion on forest lands in the tropic or something like that. That's certainly my understanding. Another thing I would point out about some interesting research going on now is also looking at even some of our most productive lands in the Midwest, for example, have areas within the field that are actually unprofitable. And so as farmers add seed and fertilizer, they actually, if you look at a detailed view of the field, they're in fact losing money year in, year out on particular areas within the fields. As we get these kinds of understandings of maximizing profitability and how farmers utilize the land, things like, for example, putting in perennial grasses and buffer strips within areas of the field that are not productive, could actually maintain production, but also improve the bottom line for farmers. So I think we have the opportunity to look at a more nuanced way going forward with some of the technologies we have now to obviously keep our agricultural production at the highest level in terms of quality products and enhancing farmers' income, but also maintaining protection for sensitive lands or lands that are not necessarily well suited for production.
Well, thank you, sir. And unfortunately, I'm out of time. Madam Chair, I apologize, and I yield back.
I now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for convening this hearing. Thank you to our witnesses. First, just some comments. I'd like to speak about an issue of critical importance in Washington State, which is the status of the State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement, or the SAFE initiative. In Washington state, these state acres are particularly critical for two native birds. Sage grouse are currently state listed as threatened, and sharp-tailed grouse are state listed as endangered. And their population estimates in 2019 were only 676 and 834 individuals, respectively. Most of the habitat remaining to support prairie grouse in Washington state is on private lands. And the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, and SAFE in particular, is really one of the only programs available to conserve this habitat and these acres at meaningful scale. Now, there's a cap on the number of acres of environmentally sensitive land that the CRP program will pay landowners to farm or not to farm per county. And SAFE acres used to be eligible for a waiver to exempt them from those acres, but because of provisions in the 2018 Farm Bill, that is no longer the case. So limiting the acreage that CRP will support by including SAFE lands in that overall number will remove financial incentives for farmers to conserve that land and will have a devastating effect, not just on soil and water, but also on these wildlife resources like the threatened sage grouse and the sharp-tailed grouse on private lands. So should those SAFE acres remain ineligible for exemption, sage and sharp-tailed grouse conservation efforts could falter as nearly 50,000 acres of CRP land expire, and this could leave our farmers subject to violations for further endangering these birds. So I wanted to ask about reinstating these waivers. I'll be sending a letter to FSA Administrator Ducheneau asking about the best way to reestablish this waiver process, and I wanted to bring this to your attention. Now, I also want to touch on other conservation programs, including the EQIP program, which provides financial and technical assistance to agriculture producers looking to conserve natural resources on their farms and ranches. And through EQIP, the federal government provides producers with financial resources and one-on-one help to plan and implement conservation practices that can lead to cleaner water and air, healthier soil, and more resilient crops, all while improving agricultural productivity, as we've heard about already. EQIP works so well for the farmers and producers in my district, but I've recently heard of some concerns specifically about the reimbursement rates that NRCS uses being out of date and not really reflecting the true cost of the practices being implemented. This is especially true in urban or semi-urban areas where the costs are so much higher. So for example, an EQIP-supported irrigation efficiency project in Pierce County, NRCS's reimbursement rate came back at only 31% of the total cost, forcing the local conservation district to pony up $89,000 to cover the shortfall. So I have a question for Mr. Johansen. You talked about the EQIP program and its importance in California. Have you come across similar issues with reimbursement rates in the Farm Bill conservation programs? And given this, how can we better incentivize climate smart ag practices?
Well, certainly, like I mentioned in my opening statement, it is the most popular program in California, EQIP. Currently, we have around 1,200, I believe we have 1,400 different EQIP projects covering about 400,000 acres. The reimbursement rates are going to be, are always a question in terms of it makes sense, and it depends on what the time is. And right now, any type of irrigation adjustment, if you're going out trying to source any sort of irrigation, it just simply isn't there. I think Representative Allen had mentioned that we are in a scarcity time for whatever reason when it comes to either timber or also steel. So yeah, certainly that has to be taken into account. And that's something that in California, where it's extremely expensive to do business, as turns out probably like Washington too, those rates can be, there can be an inequity in terms of the reimbursement rates.
Thank you. I yield back the remainder of my time. Appreciate it.
I now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. It's great to be on here. So I'm a farmer, and we implement these practices on our farm, all of them. And we've had great success. But I do have a question for Mr. Johansen. We've observed two issues, and I was wondering if you have any ideas, solutions for this. One is that we're in the minority of using these practices, cover crops, crop rotation, no-till, rotation and all that. But other farmers will tell us that they want to implement these, but they share crop or they're cash renting their land, and the owners are not open to these conservation practices. And where we are, our big issue is soil erosion, because it's very flat land. It's the best soil in the world, and our topsoil is running down to the Gulf. So if we could just do cover crops and reduce tillage, that would be fantastic. So does anybody, or do you have ideas of how to motivate the landowners to want to get on board with these practices?
And that's a difficult part in terms of the long-term investments a lot of these programs are, especially with rented land. And, are landowners willing to sign those long-term leases, putting in fence that can last up to, for required organic, for good organic grazing kind of methods, is a 10, 15-year investment. I think that there could be a part of it in terms of landowners' outreach to them. They're probably maybe a generation removed. A lot of times in California, the land that's being rented, the owner actually lives maybe in San Francisco or Los Angeles. I haven't really thought about how we engaged, the landowner. But certainly, I think it's an education part of it. But I would think that most landowners, I know as a first generation farmer, the first time I tried to go rent land, I lost to the guy who'd been farming for 40 years because the landowner was more assured that he knew the practices that would keep that land productive and keep it going. I think there could be part of the outreach that would have to get into, and we certainly do at Farm Bureau in terms of outreaching to the urban communities of what we are already doing on our farms to adapt smart agricultural climate practices.
Mm-hmm. And I have one other question. Another thing we've observed is, so I have 7 children, and several of them have gone to universities, and some have gone to the local community colleges, and some have majored in ag production. And our observation is that the community colleges seem to be slower about teaching these conservation practices than the universities. And I was wondering if you had any ideas for, solutions on that end.
No, I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think one of the things, and I see Professor Paustian is on here as well, and he would confer that one thing that I probably didn't put into my opening statement, but is in the written statement, is the need to fund education. And in agriculture, that's been our extension advisors, our extension offices, our UC extension offices, will be critically important parts of climate smart agriculture. And it has been a funding difficulty. Funding has been cut in California, but they're critical. So as we see, UC Davis is our major research university, coming up with great programs. But I farm up in Oroville, Chico State, in that area of Butte County, hour north of Sacramento. A different place to farm, a different climate than, say, farming in the Salinas Valley or farming down in Kern County. So it's important that we invest in our universities and that agricultural research. We can't forget that at some time it has to get down to the lower level. That's community college or our state schools like at Chico State, which has a demonstration farm, which is tasked with how do we apply these technologies at the local level that serves local farmers. And it certainly is right now, I'm sure, in community colleges in California, with the type of budget cuts at one point we thought we were facing. Of course, now the governor's announcing a huge surplus. So hopefully that trickles down to more investment in our research. A lot of the first programs they cut is in the agricultural program, because it is equipment or property intensive cost to do those programs. But you bring up a great point. it does come to having enough funding to engage, both at our community college, state schools, but also our cooperative extension, who is a trusted entity for farmers.
Well, it's, if I may add, I believe it's information more than the funding. That's my opinion. But anyway, thank you so much, and I yield back.
I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Speaking of the Salinas Valley, no, I'm kidding. Thank you, President Johansen, for mentioning the salad bowl of the world in your answers, which obviously I'm going to go into where I come from on the central coast of California. Like many of my colleagues, I was in the district for the past 2 weeks and having a good opportunity to speak with and have sit downs with farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners. And as you can imagine, the topics that are coming up, labor, as labor always does, as Mr. Allen mentioned from Georgia, but no, in California, obviously that's a big issue. But then, of course, water and wildfire, what's going on in our state and what we have been and will continue to deal with when it comes to our drought and then our wildfire season as well. As many of you know, our governor expanded the state's drought emergency proclamation to include 41 counties, including San Benito County in my district. And that means that basically 30% of California's population is now living in a drought state of emergency. At the same time, many of these places are still recovering from the historic 2020 wildfire season. In my district alone, we endured wildfires in or around my district that affected 650,000 acres. That were actually burned, unfortunately. And then we had to go through the post-wildfire effects of dealing with the flooding and burn scars as well. And I think we can all probably acknowledge that climate change is at the root of these crises. And that is why this hearing is so important today. So I thank the Madam Chair for holding it. As we look to reassess and build on our federal conservation programs, I do believe that we got to ensure that farmers, ranchers, and foresters have a seat at the table in these types of discussions, first of all. Second of all, they got to have the ability to access and fully leverage these programs to save water, reduce wildfire risk, and to ultimately invest in the long-term health of their lands. Now, Dr. Paustian, in California, you're probably familiar with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, the NRCS. That's been helping producers employ irrigation water management techniques, including irrigation scheduling. Can you elaborate in ways that those types of federal programs can better help producers who are seeking conserved water, and what are some of the co-benefits of these types of water saving practices that they employ?
Thank you, Representative Panetta, and you make a really great point, and that is there's a lot of synergism between things like water management, drought, soil carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, nutrient management, and we're working a lot with NRCS in California, but also with the California Department of Food and Ag, and we've actually been working with them recently on developing a new online tool called the SWEET tool, which looks at the co-benefits of water savings from improved irrigation management systems on things like water savings, but also greenhouse gas emissions. So I think there's a lot of room for improving programs that support conservation practices that are, if you will, holistic, that look at the multiple benefits of not only carbon storage, greenhouse gas, but water use efficiency and nutrient use efficiency and things of this nature. So I think it's really key that we take that approach. And fortunately, I would say that the conservation practices that NRCS has defined and which are supported by these different programs, one of the real virtues of them is they have these multiple benefits. They are, in general, they help the health and productivity of the systems, And so there's not so often that you have major trade-offs. Oh, I want to save water. Oh, that's going to hurt my carbon. It tends to be synergistic.
Okay, and I appreciate that, and I agree. And look, I just want to follow up with real quickly on Ms. Miller's line of questioning about, I think we get the benefits of no-till farming and cover cropping, but man, in my district, we got specialty crops, and we don't have the water resources necessary to do that. So, I mean, can you assure us that the federal conservation programs can better take into consideration these realities of the differing crops throughout our nation?
Well, yeah, I can't really speak for USDA, but certainly from the scientific standpoint, I think we understand that there's not a single solution that works everywhere, right? So we have to have not only programs, but also the scientific knowledge that's granular, that looks at the particular circumstances in a particular area, particular soil type, climate, growing system, and I think we can do that. And I think that's that needs to be perhaps emphasized more in policy, but I believe it is to a large extent. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Dr. Paustian. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. I agree with so much of what my colleagues have said today. And of course, that's what I hear from a lot of farmers and ranchers. Really, anytime I'm talking to South Dakotans who work in production ag, they emphasize time and time again to me two things. Number one, farmers and ranchers really are a part of the climate solution. And they have contributed so much to the progress we have already made as a country. And they have pride behind that. And then secondly, that rural economies really do need production agriculture. And frankly, the world needs American production agriculture if we're going to continue to feed the world. And so with those things in mind, I'd like each of the panelists, and we'll just go in the witness list order. So Isbell, Ratcliffe, Paustian, and Johansen. I have concerns, I have serious concerns, and I know many of my producers have concerns when they hear about 30 by 30. And I know it's more of a concept right now than a plan. I mean, details are pretty light, but when we hear about setting aside and conserving at least 30% of the American land mass by 2030, I think that causes them concern about what does that mean for American competitiveness. What does that mean for our push to feed the world? And what does that mean with regard to environmental stewardship? So could each of you comment about how you would prioritize these efforts with regard to whether or not we should be idling lands or whether or not we should be focusing on working lands conservation? And again, we'll start with Mr. Isbell. And if you could each keep your answers to between 40 and 60 seconds, I think that would be fair to the other witnesses. I want to make sure they have time to respond as well.
Thank you for that. I'll take an approach to it. So for me, the concept of feeding the world and conservation are not exclusive. They can be synergistic. New challenges require new approaches. So setting aside 30% of our land mass and not allowing it for food production is not contributing towards our goal of American competitiveness and feeding the world. But we have to look at the way CRP is implemented, and we have ways to be able to set aside land from tillable agriculture, but be able to still produce food in a regenerative way, sequester carbon, but also keep the American edge and provide financial stability for farmers.
So is it fair to say, Mr. Isbell, you wouldn't want us to overly prioritize idling land over working conservation? There's a role for both and an important role for working lands conservation. Is that right? Absolutely. Working lands conservation should be the #1 priority. Very good. Thank you, sir. Ms. Ratcliffe.
Yeah, and I'm in agreement with them. I think my main comment would be what is the goal of the 30-30? And is the goal actually accomplished by producer? Is the goal actually going to hit the ground? Is the goal actually something that is ultimately going to affect producers? Because a lot of times these programs are implemented without even coming down to people who are producers and asking our input in them. So we have to have a seat at the table when it comes to things when it comes to programs that are initially coming out, so we can put our input in and allow us to be profitable and allow us to have some kind of success story when it comes out. So I don't know if the 30 by 30 will actually provide that.
Oh, Ms. Ratcliffe, that's very well said, ma'am. Thank you. Dr. Paustian.
Thanks for the question. I would echo what Mr. Isbell said, that I think there's not a conflict between best in regenerative practices on our working lands, and if there are some lands that are not as well suited for production agriculture, that there's a role for some set aside there. But I don't believe they conflict. I think they go together. 30 by 30 is looking at focusing on biodiversity. It's looking at all land covers, and certainly we have deserts and forests and other things where there's a lot of biodiversity. I think our working lands can, they can supplement that pollinator habitat, for example, and some of the systems that Mr. Isbell and Ms. Ratcliffe manage. I think I'm sure is an important attribute of those as well. So I think it contributes to the overall goal of biodiversity maintenance.
Mr. Paustian, I got to cut you off to be fair to Mr. Johansen. Mr. Johansen, any final comments?
I agree with my fellow farmers here on the panel, focused on working lands. Of course, in California, we've already embarked on this with a governor executive order, I believe last January, for a 30 by 30 by 2030. So we've already engaged in roundtables. And as we remind the governor, working lands only work when people are allowed to work them. And if you look at California, which already is 49% public land, both state and federally owned, we can meet that number because farmers at heart are conservationists. And we know that if we look at some of the state programs we've implemented, depending on how you look at it, we're already at around 23 to being over 30% already working lands in conservation.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chair, thanks for your indulgence, and I yield back.
I now recognize the gentlewoman from Maine, Ms. Pingree, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for hosting this hearing. I apologize to some of our presenters. I had to go off to a different agricultural hearing for a little while, and if I'm repeating a question, I also apologize. But I did appreciate the testimony that I heard. And Ms. Ratcliffe really made a very important point about the barriers to participation for smaller operations and minority farmers. Some of the NRCS conservation programs have set-asides or advanced payment options for historically underserved producers, but it seems like the barriers are still too high for many farmers. So what recommendations would you make to increase awareness of access to NRCS resources for smaller farms and farmers of color?
Thank you for that question. I think the number one issue is, I don't know if they're really coming to smaller producers and looking at our goals. So the goal that necessarily NRCS want and the goal that's actually hitting the ground might be a little bit of disconnect. So I think the number one thing needs to be outreach and figure out what the small producers' goals are. And then from there, try to move it up, because a lot of times it's coming down instead of moving up. And it's prohibiting us because we do have some barriers. Our barriers might be because we don't have the cost to actually implement these programs. So we need some cost assistance to help implement those programs. We might not even have the resources to implement the program, and we might not have the capacity to actually implement these programs. So my first thing is that we need to sit at the table. We need to make sure that these small producers are sitting at the table to help make these decisions and help make these decisions that are good for our operation. Because I think a lot of times you come to us and say you must implement these, which we might not have the capacity to implement. So please, we need a foot at the table.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point, and I would certainly hope that this new USDA understands the importance of having small farmers of color at the table, but also to change the way the systems work. So we're asking the questions, not just deciding how the system should work. Dr. Paustian, I want to talk a little bit about Comet Farm. We often hear that climate change solutions can't be one size fits all, and we certainly know that agriculture doesn't look the same in every part of the country. I represent Maine, and our farmers certainly have different climate-related challenges and opportunities to reduce emissions and sequester carbon than someone would in the Midwest or California. So could you talk a little bit about the accuracy of Comet Farm in accounting for carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions across different types of operations? Yeah, that would be helpful to know.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think probably one of the advantages of Comet Farm is it's really a platform that that includes quite detailed data on things like weather and soil types that are down to the field and subfield scale. So you are capturing some of the differences, obviously, as you go across the landscape and certainly from region to region. The other attribute is that it uses a dynamic model that that integrates things like soil moisture and temperature and the the conditions that determine the agricultural system's performance. So in a sense, I think it is quite good at capturing that local capabilities. It is our basis for how good the model is really based to a large extent on our fundamental understanding, but also on field experiments that are out across the nation. And we utilize sort of all the data that we can from field experiments that have looked at measuring carbon changes over several decades, even in different practices. So we try to integrate all that in there. I do think there are some improvements that can be made that I mentioned in my opening remarks, including development of an on-farm monitoring system attached to the Natural Resource Inventory System. Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I did see those recommendations in testimony, and I think it's critically important that we make this a reliable tool and a dependable and credible measurement system. So I think it's important to look at your recommendations, and I have the good fortune of sitting on the Agriculture Appropriations Committee, so I'll certainly make that a priority to support the system. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair, and thank you again for having me.
I now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore, for 5 minutes. Impeccable timing, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have a couple of other committee meetings going as well. So this is for Dr. Paustian. I thank you all for appearing today and in my conservation efforts, often through partnerships with land-grant universities, such as Auburn University, where I graduated, Tuskegee University, and Alabama A&M. Would you be willing to go into more detail regarding how extension programs and land-grant universities support producers in improving soil and water health and incorporating technologies such as precision agriculture?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think as a number of the other panelists had mentioned before, this outreach to producers is critically important. I think we've got more that we can do from the university side. Bringing this information out to farmers. We're actually working with NRCS as well as some NGOs, including the Carbon Cycle Institute and Mad Agriculture, Quivira, and other universities in developing a curriculum for carbon farm planning that we hope to be launching soon, and working with NRCS so that their technical service providers can go out and help to provide more information about how these new practices work and how they can best be implemented for the particular areas that farmers are in. Because I think, as we mentioned before, the kind of the site-specific context, things in Alabama are very different than they are in Minnesota or Maine or other places. So we really need to have that granularity. And I think the ag, both the ag college folks as well as NRCS have a key role to play there.
Thanks, sir. And also, this
Mr. Moore, it appears you have a challenged connection. We're having trouble hearing you.
Thank you for your comments on your experience with the NRCS, conservation districts, and the USDA service centers.
Mr. Moore, the connection that you have is... Mr. Moore, we're having trouble understanding your question with your connection.
Where these bonds
Mr. Moore, we have a connection that's not working with you. We're going to continue on. Mr. Moore, if you can hear me, we're having trouble hearing you. The connection's quite bad. It appears to be the case for everyone else. So we're going to continue on with Mr. Costa's question and come back to you, Mr. Moore, if we get the connection rectified. Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Costa for 5 minutes, and Mr. Moore, we're going to try and get your connection clearer, and we'll come back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson for the subcommittee. This is an important hearing that the subcommittee is holding, looking at Title II and exploring smart climate change practices, because I believe American agriculture can play and is playing an important role in reducing our carbon footprint and as well as water waste streams. I want to underline a comment that that our colleague Congressman Panetta talked about, that really many of you have spoken to, and that is one size doesn't fit all in terms of regional challenges that we face as it relates to our carbon footprint and how we can make efforts. And I'm glad that Dr. Paustian, you indicated that cover crops may have good applications in some areas, but certainly where you have drought conditions in the West, especially in California, as we're experiencing extreme drought conditions, cover crop is just not going to work. Kimberly Ratcliffe, you talked about some of the issues that was raised with my previous colleague about programs for small farmers, minority farmers. And my experience over the years has been that NRCS and Farm Services Administration, frankly, don't have the capability to reach out to small farmers. In my area, especially, we have cultural and language barriers that exist. Would you agree that we need to do a better job? And I've said that to the current Secretary of Agriculture in making these efforts with the USDA more user-friendly.
I'd absolutely agree. I think one of the major issues is the locations of a lot of the USDA office. They're so distant from a lot of the producers that it's pretty much hard to participate in the program. If you have to drive an hour and a half just to see someone within the USDA office, it's going to be hard for someone to get off a ranch or a farm that are out there every day to go visit a USDA office. So many USDA offices were shut down. So that's one thing. We need to open up all these USDA offices back up in regions that will assist more ranchers. The other thing I think that is key that can actually help USDA is partnership. I'm going to go back to the 100 ranchers. We have private and university partnership and USDA partnership. All of us help get out the USDA requirements. All of us help fill out documentations for producers. If there's more ways for us to partner with private institutions, I think that will be a tremendous
No,
help.
and I would agree with you. My time's expiring, but I think the public-private partnerships are essential, as well as with our colleges, universities, land-grant universities, and I'm attempting in California to do just that. Jamie Johnson, Johansen, I'm sorry, my friend, you are doing a terrific job as the president of California Farm Bureau and your leadership nationwide. I've got limited time, but you talked importance of Title II programs, EQIP. I think we're going to get broadband expanded nationwide as one of the good things that come out of this horrific pandemic. But I'd like you to talk about the efforts that we've had in California in terms of federal conservation programs to complement California's efforts. Do they work together? Do we need to make changes as we work on additional strategies to help farmers implement climate smart practices?
Yeah, and certainly I'd mentioned that EQIP does work. Our Healthy Soils program does work well with the EQIP. It is a potential there. The other big program we have, and I know important in the Valley as well, is the farmer program, which is the funding agricultural replacement measures for emission reductions farmers. So that is to replace tractors. And so cleaner, more efficient tractors, cleaner engines, cleaner burning engines. It's been a struggle to maintain that funding. Certainly there could be greater interaction on the federal level along with that program. Another important program, and I think Dr. Paustian had mentioned it, was our SWEET program, first the state water efficiency and enhancement program that we have going on in California that has been successful in conserving, over around 130,000 acres now annually as we bring in water efficiencies. So, if we can use these state programs and the federal program just to build on each other and expand, there's a lot of opportunity out there.
My time's expiring, Jamie, but you're doing a terrific job. But on the listening solutions, I've worked with Karen Ross, our ag secretary in California, about the reviews that they've done to assess California's success. I want to talk to you further about how we implement that in terms of a nationwide effort and your thoughts and ideas. I don't know if you care to comment or if we have any. I have no time left, but it's an important effort, I think.
Always happy to visit, Congressman. And all too often it feels like California we've been down this before, so happy to share our experiences, whether that is a success or even just the burden of, a new program sometimes. As farmers, we get a lot of programs that start out as carrots and can end up as a stick down the road. And, we have to remember that like the climate, it can change, and so can conditions on the farm in terms of what works and what doesn't work based on that condition.
Long-term funding commitments are critical.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairperson, for allowing me to sit in on your subcommittee. Let's keep up the good work and work together. You're doing a great job.
Thank you very much. And to the witnesses, we've heard from Mr. Moore's office that he will not be coming back to ask a question, but the committee invites him to submit any additional questions in written form moving forward. This concludes the first round of questions. The ranking member and I would like to do an additional round for anyone who might have any additional questions. And so I'll begin very briefly. Mr. Isbell, I would like to ask you a pretty straightforward, simple question. We've gone into depth in your written testimony and in your spoken testimony as well about the benefits of the different practices and programs that you make use of on your farm. But if you could just tell us a little bit for anybody who might be watching this hearing and not with an agricultural background, not someone who's really focused on these topics, what compelled you to utilize these practices on your farm, and what does that look like from a day-to-day perspective, and why do you keep doing it? Could you explain kind of more in layman's terms some of the real benefits of the practices that you utilize on your farm? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So for me, when we were growing and developing our farming operation, and me being the third generation and my kids hopefully becoming the fourth, for us it's looking about sustainability. And a lot of people throw around the term of sustainability, but it's not just about conservation, environmental sustainability, but also financial stability and sustainability. And so by utilizing these practices, we were turned on to them through a lot of research, talking to folks who have implemented the practices and the benefits that they have seen from that implementation. And that's what led us down that direction. So instead of continuing a traditional sense of cropping and livestock raising, we wanted to see, we could see things changing within the environment, within the marketplace, and wanting to adapt and knowing that the practices of the last 50 years are not going to get us to the next 50 years. And so looking at those and how they would incorporate. And so really we've seen a reduction in our manpower that's needed to accomplish the same goal. We've increased our soil organic matter, which holds more water, which helps prevent us from seeing the effects of the droughts that we're seeing. We're seeing greater soil biology. That biology then gives us fertility, which allows the plants to grow at a better rate without us having to implement a nutrition program. We're able to recycle nutrients by incorporating our livestock into our cover crops and our crop rotations. So it's really a synergistic effect. It's not a one size fits all, but it's definitely an approach that with adaptation can be implemented across the states. Of course, with each environment, there's different needs and conditions that dictate different implementation, but it's certainly utilizing a land stacking enterprising operation allows for both conservation, food production, and economic stability for us.
Thank you very much for that answer. And if I could get you, again, for anyone who may not be focused on these issues, the use of cover crops and the use of rotational grazing, in pretty basic, straightforward terms, what does that actually mean? The use of cover crops?
Yes. So for us, typically a grain operation would plant a harvestable crop, say corn, and then they may leave it fallow or empty, not planting anything else until the following year when they would plant, say, soybeans. Or sometimes in Virginia, we have a typical 3-crop rotation where it's corn, soybeans, and wheat in succession. If you leave the land fallow in between with nothing growing on it, the cover crop then takes that place. So it allows for you to grow a crop that you're not going to harvest, which captures nutrients to keep them from running off in the off season. It reduces erosion. And in turn, when we roll down the cover crop or terminate it mechanically. So what we're doing at that point is and the whole time that cover crop is growing is we're sequestering carbon. The plant that is growing is pulling carbon, pulling it into its roots. Then when the plant dies off, we're now adding carbon to the soil, which feeds the biology of the soil. So we're capturing nutrients, feeding the soil, growing organic matter, and all this in a time in which the average producer would not have anything growing in the field. So it costs us money up front. And most farmers, well, why would I spend the money to put in the crop that I'm not going to gain anything out of? So you see it leave your bank account, but don't see anything come in return. But it requires to convey to farmers that really what I see when I'm investing in a cover crop is I'm putting money in the bank for the future. By building that organic matter and soil health, I'm putting money in the bank that I'll be able to utilize later by having my successive cash crop after the cover crop usage. And in turn with our livestock operation, we are also able to utilize the livestock on those cover crops, periodically grazing them, stimulating vegetative growth and furthering our sequestering of carbon and building of soil biology.
Thank you, Mr. Isbell. I appreciate you indulging me in that question. Living in the county just next door to where you are, and representing a district that's suburban and rural and agricultural, I think it's so important that that those who may not have an agricultural background really understand the benefits and the choices that you all are making on your land. And so I'm grateful that you took the time to make that explanation. Hopefully it'll make clear why these programs are so important. And so I thank you for that. And I now yield to the ranking member for a second round of questions.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. I'd probably go mostly with Dr. Paustian on this. I want to get into maybe a little technical on no-till and on sequestration. This isn't some political, rhetorical question here. I'm a farmer in my real life myself, and so we farm rice. We farm it in a certain way that's been successful for many, many years, and so we don't generally engage in the cover crop kind of thing because we don't really have the luxury of time, and certainly this year in California we don't have the luxury of water to do anything other than try and grow, whether it's my or any of my neighbors' crops or anybody else up and down the state. They got to grow to try and stay in business this year with what water they have. And as we've seen, some areas have been cut dramatically. Some were told they were going to get 5% of their normal allocation. Now they're going back on and taking that 5%. That's from right out of U.S. Bureau of Reclamation in certain parts of the state. I mean, 0% allocation. They don't have any options on doing any of this that we're talking about here because it's survival. Klamath Basin, same thing. I mean, it's just incredible how difficult it's going to be this year. But when we're talking about whether it's no-till and what is sequestered in, say, that top 4 to 8, maybe 12-inch layer of soil, what are the effects when you do finally go back and till the land to change a crop or put it back into play after it's been idle for 1 year, 5 years, what have you? The next time you till that ground, are we releasing the carbon that you've just done all the work to try to sequester in the soil? I understand carbon stays sequestered in wood products and things like that that are more or less permanent, but talk about that, Dr. Paustian, and others on the panel that would like to weigh in on that that feel so. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Representative. So yeah, when we're looking at soil carbon, we're really trying to essentially manage a balance, right? And I think what Mr. Isbell said was really important, that conservation practices, you're generally trying to accomplish two things to add more carbon to the soil. And one is you want to, the carbon's in the atmosphere, so the longer you can have a growing plant on the soil and capturing more of that CO2 and introducing it into the soil through the roots and the crop residues, the better off you are. Also, in general, if you can reduce the amount of soil disturbance, you tend to maintain the organic matter from being decomposed as quickly as it might otherwise do. So you're trying to manage that carbon balance and increase the stocks there. But it is different with different types of systems. And you mentioned rice cultivation, and typically I would say that in a rice system, probably from a climate standpoint, the thing that you want to focus on is probably, are there ways to reduce methane emissions from rice, either through the kind of varieties, if they're suitable, or through water management to have the system not flooded quite as often. So there are management techniques that work in rice systems to reduce methane emissions.
Yeah, we've been trying them all for 90 years. So it's a situation where we're also we used to burn the rice straw at the end of the season, which wasn't popular finally in more recent years. And so my own farm, we've been working really hard to bale it and remove it and find other products for it. But it's a very extremely limited market. So we're stuck with having to, instead of the burn, chop, disc, and flood, which does have its own new problems when you do that, making the straw decompose. So, and so we don't have the option of cover crop or of no-till in that situation. And there's other crops that would probably chime in with other unique situations. So I guess what's the bottom line though on if you do till the soil, are you going to lose the carbon that you've sequestered?
if you would, I would say if you, let's say you're doing maybe not rice farming, but let's say you're on upland soils and you've been doing no-till and cover crops and things like this. If you then sort of abandon those practices, then over time your carbon levels will tend to go back down towards where they were before. So it is important that we have systems that, as Mr. Isbell said, are not only environmentally sustainable, but economically sustainable. So if you have a system that is sequestering carbon, building that carbon, and you're making more money doing that, then I think the good news is that the likelihood of maintaining those practices over time is much greater if they're more profitable.
Yeah, many in the Midwest are multi-cropping on a rotation and such, so I'm not here to, badmouth it or anything. I'm just saying it sounds to me like once you get into a particular flow on this, a particular method, that you don't get out of a no-till method without the carbon penalty, I guess you would say. And that would lead to other concerns for me is somewhere on the line, is there going to be requirements you're required to stay in that type, otherwise you're emitting carbon and now you're one of the bad guys, even though crop rotations, changing crops, or just a necessity to air the soil. And maybe you have when they change orchards and such, they have to go in and deep rip and kill nematodes, things like that. So anyway, it's just an ongoing discussion, and I want to be sure that we all have flexibility in ongoing programs, that if there's a need to change or to move in a different direction with that crop, that doesn't become a penalty or a red letter on how our farmers need to practice. So thank you for the extra time. I appreciate it.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Costa of California for 5 minutes.
Okay, I want to once again thank the chairwoman for this important subcommittee hearing today and make a few points. Certainly my colleague from California, Congressman LaMalfa, makes some important points. It gets back to one size doesn't fit all, but beyond that, farming's changed. We know a lot more today than we did a generation ago. I farm too, that's my primary source of income, but I don't farm the way my father farmed. Because of a lot of reasons, not only technology, but obviously changing crop patterns and the impacts of climate change. I want to make a point. I'd like the three of you to respond. I've been simultaneously, Madam Chairperson, participating in the Foreign Relations Committee hearing today with Senator Kerry talking about our role in the international address toward climate change. It seems to me that American agriculture has played a role and continue to play a role in reducing our carbon footprint and reducing waste streams. But I think you need two things, and the chairwoman and I have discussed this. I've discussed it with Senator Kerry and Secretary Vilsack. You need two things, I think, to be successful, and that for outcomes. One, determine what consistent funding sources we can have on a regional basis throughout the country to reduce that carbon footprint and the waste stream, water waste streams. And two, continuous funding to determine which management practices work best on the farm and the dairies and the ranches, realizing the regional differences. But goals over the next 10 years, I think, are critical, that are achievable, and a commitment on funding sources on this public-private partnership. Where, to your knowledge, are there realistic goals based upon existing practices and hopefully new practices that we can achieve in the next 10 years in American agriculture? And what are the consistent revenue streams you believe necessary as we develop a legislative package and strategy? In less than 2.5 minutes, who would like to respond?
Well, I'll start, Congressman, and thanks again. I mean, really quickly, and we haven't really discussed it here, but one of the difficulties as well, too, in implementing these programs is what's the baseline, right? Where do we set the baseline at, and how do we not punish the early adopters? And we saw that in our own carbon program here in California and what that meant to our food processors. And that's the other part of this equation too is our food processors and ultimately those brands that sell our products. How do we engage them that we know the economic benefit they get for marketing a product that is, say, carbon neutral or has a lower carbon footprint? How does that end up back to the farmer, which encourages them further in those practices? I mean, we certainly saw it in the organic industry as that grew in the 80s and 90s to where it is today. But how do we engage that private sector to reward those farmers and those ranchers who are taking those steps? But again, as we implement these programs, as we come up with this baseline, it's going to be critical that the early adopters aren't penalized.
I agree. And voluntary, I think, is an important concept in that public-private partnership. Ms. Ratcliffe, you care to comment?
Absolutely. And I'm agreeing with that baseline. And I guess my baseline would be the size. You mentioned it previously in your open comment, is not all size fits everyone. There's always different climates, there's different grasses, there's different soil types. Just within Texas, our big state is different from north to south. And I think you really got to do it regionally and look at each region separately. I don't think you can go with a global around the United States and saying, hey, this is what needs to go in every single state. I really think we need to concentrate it on regionally because it's different for each region.
It's got to be a regional strategy to set national goals.
Exactly.
Good. Finally, Doctor, do we have care to comment?
Well, I'd agree with Ms. Ratcliffe. I think we have the technologies to integrate local solutions with national policies, and I think we want to work in that area.
And as a 30-year member of the California Farm Bureau, I think Jamie Johansen's comments, we don't want to punish under the category of no good deed goes unpunished. The fact that good practices have already been installed, and we want to incentivize those good practices, I think, if we want to develop a successful overall nationwide strategy. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I really appreciate your allowing me to participate once again.
Thank you very much. If there are any other members remaining on with us today who would like to ask an additional question, please unmute yourself and seek recognition. All right, seeing none, we're going to move towards closing today. Ranking Member LaMalfa needed to head to the floor and will not be giving closing statements. So I will continue and close out this hearing. I want to thank Ranking Member LaMalfa and all of our witnesses here today. I truly appreciate this discussion. It's been informative. I thank you for spending extra time with us for our second round of questions, and I want to emphasize my commitment to ensuring that we are exploring every avenue for addressing the climate crisis, through every avenue for improving upon and our conservation programs. I appreciate the time that you all spent today answering our questions, making clear why these programs are so incredibly important, the value that they have on the farms in your states. Dr. Paustian, thank you for all of your research. And as the committee considers opportunities to leverage Title II programs and research, our continuing possibilities for mitigating climate change, I do want to keep in mind many of the excellent points that were raised here today. I also hope that we'll walk out of this hearing with a greater clarity of the benefits of these conservation programs, and also how we may continue to ensure that we're seeing these benefits at a larger scale. So I appreciate you bringing your personal experiences, answering our questions, and really helping to inform committee members here today. So to all of our witnesses, again, I thank you very much. Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witnesses to any question posed by a member. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Conservation and Forestry is adjourned.
Thank you.